Hello everyone, it's Katabanas. I wanted to retrospect this old but gold argument and an absurdity within Islam, specifically in the Salafi tradition. To be clear, what is Salafism? Salafism is a conservative movement within Sunni Islam that seeks to return to the pure and original form of Islam that was practiced by the three earliest generations of Muslims. Salafis believe that Allah is one, He is the sole legislator, and that His attributes are affirmed in their apparent meaning as described in the Quran and the Sunnah without likening them to creation, negating them, or asking how. They strongly oppose philosophical interpretations of Allah's attributes, considering them religious innovations, namely bid'ah, that deviate from the earliest Muslims' understandings. Salafis don't question it because critical thinking would destroy their silly position. In other words, they affirm the attributes of Allah to be real and literal, but they don't liken it to creation. Furthermore, they condemn philosophical speculation of Allah and the attributes because they're allergic to common sense, hence why Avicenna and even Averroes is condemned in their circles. In this video, I'll be presenting an argument which viably proves from an Islamic standpoint that not only do Catholics and Muslims not worship the same God, but also that Mohammedans are polytheists who adore a creature and is nothing like our God who is triune, immaterial, and absolutely simple, and is nowhere near to the Mohammedan God in comparison, at least the Salafi interpretation. Let me demonstrate an old syllogism that was made back in the day, and I'll be using Sunni scholars and Aristotelian metaphysics to prove the point. Before I start, I want you to keep these two verses in mind. Firstly, attributes like being all-knowing, Al-Alim, and all-merciful, Ar-Rahman, these attributes seem distinct from Allah's essence. If these attributes are separate from His essence but essential to who He is, then wouldn't He be a composite of essence and attributes? Let E be the essence of Allah, whether it be unknown and unknowable, and let A be the set of all of Allah's attributes, including Al-Alim and Ar-Rahman. Asharis and Maturidis believe that E and A somehow overlap completely. Imagine E and A being equal circles completely superimposed. Every point in E is also a point in A, and vice versa. Allah's essence encompasses all attributes inherently. Salafis and Hanbalis see E and A as very distinct sets. They imagine E as a smaller circle within a larger circle A. E represents the core essence, and A represents all the attributes surrounding it. The attributes are distinct from the essence, but are still essential to who Allah is. Does this make Allah composite? In set theory, if E and A are completely separate sets, like in the Salafi view, then EUA, being the union of E and A, would be considered a composite object, therefore composite. Now, Ash'aris and Maturidis are irrelevant here, because they're not the object of my polemical attack, so let's focus back on the Salaf. Furthermore, keep in mind that the classical position of Sunni scholars is that the attributes of God, such as power, will, and knowledge, are not identical to His essence, nor are they separate from it. Their being non-identical returns to the manner in which each is rationally conceptualized in the mind. The reality of an essence is not the same as the reality of an attribute. The attribute of power that subsists through the essence of X is not identical to the essence of X. Rather, the mind conceives of a particular meaning for an attribute that is distinct to that which it conceives for an essence. It is from this perspective of how the meaning of an attribute and essence is conceptualized in the mind that scholars formulated the same statement that an attribute is not the same as an essence. Thus, the conclusion follows: if the attributes are distinct, different from the essence yet subsist in it, then this would regard composition and hundreds of eternal realities. But that is not all. Certified Sunni scholar Ustad Salman Yunus of Seeker's Guidance answers the following. A question was given to him that asked, quote, "Is this belief that the attributes of Allah are not the essence of Allah, but they are not other than Allah, illogical?" Unquote. And he answers, quote, "Assalamu alaikum. This formation is not illogical." Unquote. Now, before we continue, one may point out that Ustad Salman Yunus is an Ash'ari, but notice how I mentioned earlier that he is a scholar for Sunnism and in general, not particularly Ash'arism, and gives us the general Sunni position on the matter. So he directly concedes to what is necessary to dismantle the Salafi God via simple consideration. Think of the color red as apart from the apple without implying that redness doesn't exist in the apple. Thus, if a form is not identical to a particular, then the intellect can abstract them both from each other as separate as long as a form truly subsists in the particular. God's perfections, as Mohammedans would say, is contained eminently in one thing, and is conceptually distinct, but truly inseparable in reality. So it goes back to what I previously said. A virtual abstraction can follow from here. If any entity Y is not identical to a necessary X, then it does not share full necessity and is thus contingent. Other words, dependent. Consider Allah and the attribute of power. They are conceptually distinct because they lack identicality to each other. Thus, they can be virtually separated, and the question remains, is Allah's essence going to be powerful in of itself? If you said yes, you have created two new powerful objects and have fallen to polytheism, which is the sin of shirk in Islam and removes you from the religion. If you said no, congratulations, you have conceded that Allah is a sandwich dependent on something other than Himself, which results in Allah being no more of a creature than man or jinn. It is no different from you relying on Allah to exist, because the Salafi God depends on existence, or any other given attribute at that matter, to be what they say He is, and then the question is begged, who is God in Islam? Because it surely is not Allah or the Salafi God. Let me construct a syllogism to better formalize this argument. Let the major premise be the following. If a being's attributes are metaphysically distinct from its essence, then the being is composite and therefore contingent, or a creature. Let the minor premise be that a being that is necessary must not be composite in order to prevent contingency. Finally, let the conclusion be, therefore, in a necessary being, its attributes must be metaphysically identical to its essence to preserve unity and necessity, otherwise a creature is being adored. Denying the first premise, in other words, the major premise, is rejecting common sense, and you would have to prove that composition does not equal contingency without contradicting logic, which usually the interlocutor will end up doing if they attempt to go down this path. Furthermore, denying the minor premise introduces an admixture of act and potency in the law. Furthermore, it logically entails that in every composite being there is a cause, yet God is uncaused but somehow composite. Thus a contradiction arises, and the Mohammedan would be challenging the doctrine of divine aseity at that point, and logically he challenges the idea of any God by challenging this principle, and it leads to his God not being necessary, and it becomes a creature, and it leads to either a higher being above Allah, which Muslims will deny, or atheism, which is metaphysically impossible due to the many principles that require the existence of a necessary being. If you have made it this far, congratulations to the Salafis. You worship a Lego and have committed shirk for associating partners with Allah and have deviated from Tawheed, thus becoming the enemies of Allah and the Ummah according to the Quran and the Sunnah. Also, I find it interesting how Ibn Taymiyyah, the 2 IQ polytheist whom Sunni theologians praise excessively, had believed a hadith regarding Allah. The hadith goes as follows, taken from Bayan Talbis al-Jamiyah, Volume 7, page 290. Quote, "We conclude that it was eyesight, as it is in the Sahih narration from Qatada, from Ikrama, from Ibn Abbas, said that the Prophet said, 'I saw my God in an image of a beardless man with long curly hair in a green garden.'" Unquote. Back to those Quranic texts I had told you to keep in mind. Now apply those verses to what we have just read. This is clearly a blunder in Islamic philosophy and theology, and it is clearly embarrassing for Taymiyans to follow such a clown of a philosopher who just conceded to tasbih and became a kafir for committing shirk. Muhammad contradicts the Quran he claims that Allah sent down. Not only this, but Allah is a hypocrite by the very fact he forbids attributing likeness of creation to him when he resembles it according to a vision that his quote-unquote Prophet Muhammad had. How does Aristotle respond to this? Simply speaking, he already did. In Metaphysics, Book 12, Lecture 5, he informs us that a first cause must have a substance of pure act and furthermore be immaterial. Otherwise, this mover would have a substance that is in potency and cannot produce motion in another. Quote, "And even if it does act, this will still not be sufficient if its essence is a potency, for there will be no eternal motion, since what is potential may possibly not be. Hence, there must be a principle of the kind whose substance is an act. Further, such substances must also be immaterial, for they must be eternal if anything else is. Hence, they are acts." Unquote. This is completely contrary to what we have just read, especially with the description given by Ibn Taymiyyah. The fact we virtually abstracted the dat and the sifat from each other would also be viewed critically by Aristotle, who believed in the form of divine simplicity. St. Thomas, commentating on Aristotle's Physics Book 8, Lecture 4, says, quote, "The first of these is that whereby he proved in Book 6 that no change is infinite, because by the same argument it can be proved that no change is eternal. For no terminated change is eternal any more than it is infinite, but every change is terminated. For every motion is naturally from something to something, and these two are contraries. Hence of necessity, the termini of any change are the contraries within the sphere of that change. But because contrariety of termini is not evident in all cases of local motion, Aristotle adds something common to every motion, namely, that nothing is moved to infinity because nothing is moved to what it cannot reach, as has been said in Book 6. Accordingly, it is clear that no motion is perpetual, just as it is not infinite. If, therefore, no motion is perpetual, it also seems possible to posit a time in which there is no change. This first argument is taken from motion." Unquote. Aristotle also believed that this first mover cannot be in any motion at all, because change is not eternal, since every change is eventually terminated, and motion naturally is received by something prior to the body which is in motion. This is also a contradiction to the Sunnis, who believe that Allah descends through the heavens at any given time period. Here is what Islam QA says, quote, Allah descends every night to the lowest heaven when 1/3 of the night remains. The descent of Allah to the lowest heaven is in a real sense, in a manner that befits His majesty and might. Allah descends however He wills, whenever He wills. Unquote. What a blatant contradiction. This proves that their God is in motion, is contingent, and also that He is in time. These are the defining qualities of a creature, hence why the Salafia are confident by the fact they are polytheists insofar as their beliefs logically conclude to Allah and any attribute being distinct from Himself but somehow necessary to Allah, to polytheism, and the attributes as other entities that Allah is relying on to be what they say He is. So much for Tawhid.